And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. And this is, as stated, this is Friday morning. And on Friday mornings, and by the way, my name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And on Fridays, I spend time responding to the critics, those individuals who have written books, they've done videos, written articles, done blogs, or whatever, rejecting the truth of covenant eschatology and attacking those of us who believe in the Lord that He kept His word as He promised He would, labeling us as heretics. And we are currently, and we're winding down on this, but we've been examining the book by Brian Hodge entitled Problems with Preterism. Now, I've told you already, I'm not going to try to address everything that he says on the Olivet Discourse. I'm not going to try to address everything that he says on 1 Corinthians 15. I'm not going to try to address everything that he says on 2 Peter chapter 3 or even on the book of Revelation. Okay? Because I have already produced hundreds, literally hundreds of videos on 1 Corinthians 15, on the Olivet Discourse, on 2 Peter chapter 3. I've written books discussing, I've written a book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, which is, to my knowledge, the only full preterist commentary on 2 Peter chapter 3 that has been produced. I'm not aware of one. Maybe there is, but I'm just not aware of it. So avail yourself of those resources. So what I'm currently doing is I'm going through his book and picking out some distinctive doctrines that he discusses that are a little bit distinct from his discussions of 1 Corinthians 15, 2 Peter 3, etc., but which he spends time on. And so that's what we're doing today. I want to today talk to you about what he calls some preterist interpretations, and that's on page 77 and following. Now, last week, I shared with you his views on 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. I demonstrated that Mr. Hodge abuses hermeneutic. He ignores the audience relevance of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. And by the way, do not forget, all right, do not forget, I don't know where all these books on my desk came from. Yeah. Okay, don't forget, I made mention to you that I have a 2-book special, which is actually a 3-book special, for the month of February 2025 U.S. orders only. Now, the focus of what I want to share with you right now is this little book that you will get free when you order these 2 books. Okay? Just go to my website, donkpreston.com, Bible Prophecy. But in this book, I demonstrate the fallacy of Mr. Hodge's hermeneutic and how honoring proper hermeneutic is the way to properly interpret 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Now, I'm going to have more to say about that as we continue today. But like I said, do yourself a favor and order the 2-book special. Then what he does, he goes on page 78 and he says, I'm going to read a verse or a paragraph or two. Another interesting interpretation, and this is supposedly a full preterist interpretation, but I want to tell you something. I've been in the preterist movement, since late 80s. I've been studying eschatology since the 70s. I can truthfully say that I have never, not once, not from one single preterist, I've never even heard it written, heard it said seen it written in a single commentary about what Mr. Hodge claims preterists say. So it seems a little bit weird to me that Mr. Hodge would claim, here's what preterists believe, and he doesn't give a citation from preterist sources to document that preterists actually believe this. So in other words, what this amounts to, and like I said, maybe, just maybe, there is someone out there as a preterist that believes what Mr. Hodge claims. That doesn't mean preterists, as a rule, as a group, believe that. So once again, Mr. Hodge is setting up a straw man. And setting up a straw man is a really good debate tactic, but it's not very ethical. Okay? So here's what Mr. Hodge believes. Another interesting interpretation of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 to 12, is that the lawless one referred to here refers to a Jewish Gnostic heretic named Cerinthus. By gaining a following in the church, preterists argue. Now notice, preterists argue, Cerinthus had lifted himself up in the temple of God and led people astray. They read the following in the text in that light, so I won't read all of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. But Mr. Hodge continues, it is important to note that any identification of the man of lawlessness must meet all the criteria, not just some of it, including what is said about Christ destroying all of the wicked at his coming. The man of lawlessness must seat himself in the temple, perform all kinds of miraculous signs and wonders, lift himself up above all God and every sacred object, display himself as God, and be destroyed by the coming of the Lord. The attempt made by preterists, you see how he's broad brushing, straw manning. The attempt made by preterists to identify Cerinthus as the lawless one is made for two reasons. Number one, he is an early heretic that can be identified as being significant in his influence of what will become a major heresy. Even John's epistles are said to be written to counter his teachings. And number two, the knowledge we have of what dates to assign to his life and his exact workings in the early church is so scarce, he basically becomes a wax nose that one can form to fit the mold of the man of lawlessness. The problem with this definition, or identification, however, are legion. Okay, let me just stop here. I am constantly amazed at how people feel like the way to refute covenant eschatology is to set up one straw man after another, to mischaracterize, to misrepresent what preterists actually believe. Like I said, I've been involved in the study of eschatology since the 70s. Boy, it's a long time. Pardon me. I have been a preterist since the late 80s, mid to late 80s. I have never, not once, read or heard a single preterist. I have never read a commentary. Now, is it possible I've missed one? Of course it is. No man can read all the commentaries, every commentary. They can't be aware of what every single person believes and teaches. Not possible. I'm simply saying that in all of the reading that I've done, and I've done a fair amount of reading, ladies and gentlemen. In all of the reading that I've done, in all of the watching of preterist videos that I have done, in all of the lectureships that I have attended, I have never, not once, read or heard even the slightest suggestion from any preterist at any time to suggest that preterists believe that Cerinthus was the man of sin. So, I'm going to ask you, my viewers, if you know of anyone, any commentary, if you know of any preterists, especially, since after all, Mr. Hodge is characterizing preterists as a broad brush stroke characterization, that we all believe that Cerinthus was the man of sin. So, let me ask, if any of you, my viewers, know of any preterist, a book, an article, a blog, a video, doesn't matter, let me know about it. Okay? I want to know. But as it stands today, I have never heard, read, seen any preterist suggest such a thing. So, what about this guy, the man of sin? What can we know about him? Well, I really believe that John Bray, my friend John Bray, who passed away a few years ago, John did a tremendous amount of good for the preterist movement. I would tell you a little story about him. Where am I on time? No, I don't have time to do that this morning. But it's a really fascinating story. If you want to know about it, contact me. It was quite revealing. It was revealing of his integrity. It showed what kind of a Bible student he was. And it's always refreshing. So what do we know about the man of sin? Well, here's the situation. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul is having to write to address a problem. And he said, "Brethren, we beseech you that you do not be soon shaken in your mind or in your spirit by a letter or an epistle, as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has already come." The King James is simply a bad translation. A few other translations render it as is at hand. That's an absolutely improper translation. Okay, so Paul is addressing those who say the day of the Lord has already come, which raises a question. If the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending event, when every human being who has ever died, decomposed, and gone into the grave is raised, revived, resurrected to eternal life, how could anybody convince anybody that that event had already taken place? Right? I wrote a book on this entitled, "How Is This Possible?" And by the way, just yesterday I was corresponding on Facebook with a guy. He said, well, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul was addressing people who had changed the nature of the coming of the Lord to a spiritual event instead of a literal physical event. And Paul is writing to correct that perversion of the nature. And I'm like, what? That's not what I read from the text. So I asked this individual, can you show me from the text where Paul was saying anything about the nature of the coming of the Lord? He takes it for granted that he and the scoffers believe the same thing about the nature. And this individual responded and said, I said, the only thing that Paul corrects is the timing of the event. And this guy wrote back and says, Paul, there are no time markers in the text. And I said, well, wait a minute. Paul said those scoffers, those deniers, said the day of the Lord had already come. That's a time marker. And Paul says that day will not come except there come first the apostasy and the man of sin. That's two time markers. So yeah, there are time markers. And so this fellow responded and said, well, I was talking about the kind of markers that preterists always use. These things must shortly come to pass. I said, that's too broad of a characterization. That's a mischaracterization. These are time statements in the text that have to be honored. So I had to ask this gentleman, and he was a nice guy. I had to ask, show me from the text where Paul corrected their concept of the nature of the day of the Lord. He totally ignored it 5 times. And I finally said, I'm waiting for you to finally demonstrate where Paul corrected their concept of the nature of the day of the Lord. And he said, well, there is nothing explicit in the text. We have to kind of read that into it. Now, that's my paraphrase of what he said. And he said, it is only by reading your own concepts into the text that you can see otherwise. I said, no, that's not true. I have one agenda, and that's the truth. I have one agenda, and that's to know what the Bible actually said. I am using sound logic, proper hermeneutic, proper exegesis. And let me illustrate this. Here's what I know about the man of sin that Mr. Hodge says was not in the first century. He's in our future. By the way, let me just simply make this comment. Mr. Hodge, in his eschatology, bears more resemblance to Cerinthus than he wants to admit. He really does. Okay, so what do I know about the man of sin? I'm going to begin reading with verse 3 of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Let no one deceive you, for it, that is the day of the Lord, will not come unless the apostasy comes first. That is a time statement. And the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Point number 1, problem for Mr. Hodge. He says the man of sin would set himself up in the church. Where is that stated? It's not. He assumes, without proving it, and this fellow yesterday said the same thing, essentially, by saying that when Paul said the man of sin would be seated in the temple, that's the church. Because he said when Paul talks about the temple, he's talking about the church. Well, folks, that's a really good example of illegitimate totality transfer. You go to all these other passages and you find examples where a word is given a certain definition, and you say, well, it means that here, therefore it must mean that over here. Well, I understand the beauty and the harmony of the consistency of language. I really do. I appeal to the consistency of language very commonly in my writings. But a person has to be aware of the fact that similarity of language is not necessarily identicality of subject. It is distinctly possible that Paul could be using the reference to the temple of God, in a purely prosaic way to refer to the Jerusalem temple. So here is this man of sin. He sets himself up in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Now, I personally believe the man of sin was the Jewish high priesthood of the first century. They had usurped to themselves the role of final arbiters of God's will. And Paul says, do you not remember that while I was with you, I was telling you those things? Gee, that's another time statement. When I was with you, I was teaching you these things. Now, let me ask you, folks, do you suppose it's possible that Paul told them these things because they were events that were going to happen in their lifetime that they had to be aware of, that they had to prepare for, instead of saying, you know, brethren, when I was with you for such a short period of time, I felt it necessary to tell you about events that aren't going to happen for thousands upon thousands of years, have nothing to do with you in your life, in your struggles with your persecutors. Nothing. But he continues. What else do I know about what do I know about this man of sin? Now remember, Mr. Hodge says, or excuse me, this fellow yesterday says, there are no time statements in the text. Really? And you know what, it can be translated as who. It's difficult to know. You know what restrains him now. What? You know who or what restrains him now. Folks, I don't care who you identify or what you identify as the restrainer. Lots of really good suggestions out there. I don't care what you or who you identify the restrainer as. Point number one, the man of sin was already alive, already sitting in the temple of God, and already being restrained. I think it's certainly possible. I haven't taken a absolutely, totally firm stand on it. I'm still studying the issue. But I think it's distinctly possible that the moderate forces within Jerusalem, those who did not want war, are the ones who were restraining the zealots and the radical elements of the high priesthood who wanted war. So you have the moderates restraining the radicals. To me, that fits pretty well. But here's the bottom line. Once again, you got to catch the power of this, ladies and gentlemen. And Mr. Hodge doesn't say one thing about it. This is one of my great problems with preterism. He ignores audience relevance. How can we claim to be properly interpreting a text when we ignore the fact that the text says the man of sin is already alive? He's already sitting in the temple of God. He is already being restrained. The restrainer is already holding him back. And then he continues. You know what or who restrains him now, so that in his time, and that's the Greek word kairos, in his appointed time. That's a time statement. He will be revealed, manifested. For the mystery of lawlessness, you know, the man of lawlessness, the man of sin, is already, another time statement, is already at work. Only the one who now, time statement, restrains him will do so until, time statement, he is taken out of the way. And then, time statement, that lawless one will be revealed. Now watch this. Whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. That is, the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders, and with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish because they did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved. Now, what was the man of sin going to do when he was fully revealed? He was already at work. Don't forget that. He was already active. But he would be fully revealed pretty shortly in that generation. How do I know that? Because he's already alive. You can't be revealed after you're dead. You can't do the things that Paul describes after you're dead. So Mr. Hodge says preterists are wrong because they say Cerinthus was a man of sin. No, we don't. Not the ones I know. That's a mischaracterization, misrepresentation. And then he says, Cerinthus will be destroyed at the coming of the Lord. The Lord did not come and destroy Cerinthus. Therefore, preterism is false. That argument is so full of logical fallacies, it'd take me another program to expose them. Number one, he falsely mischaracterizes what preterists say about the man of sin. Number two, he assumes that the day of the Lord to destroy the man of sin is the end of time. But wait, go back and watch last week's program, ladies and gentlemen. Pardon me. And be sure to take advantage of my 3-book special, February 2025, U.S. orders only. You'll get a free copy of this book in which I demonstrate that the coming of the Lord of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is the coming of the Lord of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 to destroy the persecutor of the Christians, the first century Thessalonian Christians. And that was the Jews. Thus, when Mr. Hodge extrapolates from 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 into a far distant, so far 2,000 years, to a far distant future event, a far future distant man of sin, and he rips that out of its historical, first century, temporally delimited context, it is Mr. Hodge that has the problem, and it is not a problem. The text, the man of sin, is not a problem for preterism. Thanks for joining me for this morning's musings. See you on Monday.